Tonight, let the day fall away from you. Whatever you carried through the hours, the conversations still circling, the tasks left undone, the quiet weight of trying to hold everything in place. You can set all of it down now, not forever. Just for tonight, just for the length of a single breath. You do not need to solve anything in this moment. You do not need to be anywhere other than exactly where you are. There is something the body already knows about letting go, that the mind takes much longer to learn. The hands unclench when they are tired enough. The shoulders drop when the day has finally passed. The breath slows on its own when the room grows dark and quiet. Tonight, we are going to explore that knowing, not through instruction, but through stories. Old stories, gentle ones. The kind that ask nothing of you, except that you listen for as long as you wish. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you are listening from. It is always nice to know who is resting alongside us in the quiet hours. These are not lessons to memorize. They are simply stories, invitations to rest. If this path of quiet stories calls to something in you, you are welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a slower night. So, settle in now. Let your body grow heavy. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your eyes close if they want to. And let us begin. Thank you for joining us here at Moonlit Dharma. Our first story begins in a place where the mountains meet the sea. There was a woman who grew vegetables on a narrow strip of land between a cliff and the ocean. The soil was thin and stony, threaded with the roots of wild grasses that had been there longer than anyone could remember. Every spring the rain came hard off the mountains and washed half the soil away, carrying it in brown rivers down toward the water. She would wake before dawn to rebuild the low stone walls that kept her garden from sliding off the edge. The air smelled of salt and wet earth in the early hours, and her hands were always cold. The kind of cold that settles deep into the knuckles and stays there until the sun climbs high enough to warm the stones beneath her feet. She had a system for everything. The seeds went in rows, measured by a length of twine she had cut to exactly 3 feet. The watering happened at the same hour each morning. She knew which plants needed shade from the afternoon wind, and which ones grew stronger when they faced it. She had built small wooden frames, angled just so, to protect the youngest shoots. She kept a notebook where she recorded rainfall, temperature, the number of days between planting and first bud. And when a storm rolled in from the sea, she would stand at her window with her jaw tight, watching, counting the plants that bent and the ones that broke. Her neighbors admired her discipline, though some of them also thought she was exhausting herself for something the land itself did not want. The cliff was always shifting. The ocean was always reaching. But she believed that with enough effort, enough care, enough attention to every small detail, she could keep the garden exactly as she wanted it to be. A monk used to walk past her land on his way to the village below. He was old and unhurried, leaning on a walking stick that had been polished smooth by years of use. Sometimes he would stop at the edge of her wall and watch her work, bending, pulling, measuring, and she would nod but never speak, because speaking meant pausing, and pausing meant something might go wrong while her attention was elsewhere. One morning after a storm that had lasted 2 days, she found half her garden destroyed. The stone wall on the eastern side had collapsed inward. Tomatoes lay flattened in thick brown mud. The wooden frames she had spent 3 weekends building were scattered across the slope like the ribs of something broken. She was on her knees in the wet earth, trying to push the soil back into shape with her bare hands, when the monk appeared on the path above. "You are trying to put the ocean back into a cup," he said gently. She looked up at him, her face streaked with mud. If I do not fix this now, I will lose everything by tomorrow. He lowered himself onto a flat rock beside the path, his knees creaking as he settled. May I ask you something? She did not answer, but her hands stopped moving. How many times have you rebuilt that wall? Every year, she said, sometimes twice. And the rain, has it ever stopped coming? Of course not. Then what are you holding on to? The wall itself, or the idea that the wall should never fall? She sat back on her heels. The mud was cold beneath her legs. Below the cliff, the ocean moved in long, slow swells, the way it had moved before she was born, and would keep moving long after she was gone. The sound of it filled the silence between them. Not crashing, not violent, just steady, endless, unhurried. I just want things to stay, she whispered. The monk nodded, as though he had heard this many times before. That is the most human wish there is, he said quietly. And it is the one wish the world cannot grant us. Not because the world is cruel, but because nothing, not the wall, not the garden, not this morning, was ever meant to remain the same. The Buddha once said that all conditioned things are impermanent. He did not say it as a warning. He said it the way a doctor might say, "You have been holding your breath," simply pointing at what is already true. He picked up a small stone from the path and held it in his open palm. Even this, he said, even this is on its way somewhere else. It was part of a mountain once. Someday it will be sand. The only question is whether we hold it so tightly that our hand begins to ache, or whether we learn to carry it lightly, knowing it was never truly ours to keep. She looked at her garden, the broken rows, the scattered frames, the soil still sliding slowly toward the sea. And for the first time in a long while, she did not reach for her tools. She sat in the mud, breathing, letting the morning be exactly what it was. Not fixed, not perfect, just alive. The monk rose slowly and continued down the path. She could hear the soft tap of his stick against the stones long after he disappeared around the bend. The clouds shifted overhead. A single bird called from somewhere in the cliff grass, and the garden, broken as it was, went on growing. Tonight, if you are lying here with your hands still gripping the day, a decision that did not go the way you planned, a conversation you wish you could steer back to its beginning, a list of things that still feel unfinished, you already know what that woman knew. Kneeling in the mud, the grip is the ache, not the storm, not the broken wall, just the grip itself. And the strange, quiet truth is that you do not have to pry your fingers open. You only have to notice that they are closed. Sometimes that noticing, all by itself, is enough for them to soften. Thich Nhat Hanh once wrote that letting go gives us freedom, and freedom is the only condition for happiness. He did not mean the freedom of having nothing. He meant the freedom of holding nothing so tightly that it hurts. There is another way this teaching found its way into someone's life. It happened not on a cliff above the ocean, but in a city, in a very small apartment, to a man who repaired watches. His workshop was a table pushed against the window of a room that also served as his kitchen and his bedroom. The table was barely wide enough to hold his tools, but he had arranged everything with the quiet precision of someone who understood what it means to live in a small space and love it anyway. The lamp sat on the left, angled low, so the light fell in a clean circle directly onto his hands. A row of tiny screwdrivers hung from a strip of leather tacked to the wall, each one a slightly different size, each in its place. Jars of screws and springs and crystal faces lined the windowsill, labeled in handwriting, so small you would need one of his own magnifying lenses to read it. The room smelled of metal polish and old wood, and the faint sweetness of the tea he kept warming on a hot plate behind his chair. In the mornings, When the light came through the window at a low angle, the jars on the sill would throw tiny rainbows across his hands as he worked, and he would pause for a moment, watching them move before returning to whatever mechanism lay open on his table. He had been repairing watches for 40 years. People brought him movements that other shops had given up on. Timepieces so old, or so delicate, or so thoroughly broken that no one else wanted the trouble. He liked the impossible ones best. He liked opening a case and sitting with the silence of it, tracing the failure backward through a chain of tiny gears until he arrived at the single bent tooth, the one worn spring, the one hairline crack that had thrown the entire rhythm off. There was a satisfaction in it that he had never found anywhere else, the satisfaction of restoring something to the motion it was always meant to have. But there was one watch he could not fix. It had belonged to his daughter, who had died 3 years earlier in an accident that he still could not speak about without his voice going thin and strange. The watch had stopped at the exact minute. He kept it in a velvet pouch in the top drawer of his work table, and every few weeks he would take it out, open the case, and try again. He replaced the mainspring. He cleaned every gear with a brush thinner than an eyelash. He polished the crystal until it was perfectly clear. But the watch would not run. It would tick for a few seconds, 3, sometimes 4, then stop, as if it remembered something it could not move past. One afternoon, a woman came to pick up a clock he had repaired for her. She was old, with kind eyes and faded paint stains on her fingers that no amount of washing seemed to remove. She noticed the velvet pouch lying open on his table. "What is that one?" she asked. "One I cannot fix," he said. She studied his face. "Cannot fix? Or will not let yourself stop trying?" He looked at her for a long moment. The light from the window caught the dust motes, drifting slowly between them. "If I stop trying," he said quietly, "then it is really over." She nodded, as if she understood this from somewhere deep inside her own life. "I painted my husband's portrait 11 times after he passed," she said. "Each time I told myself I was trying to get his eyes right. The angle of light, the particular way he used to squint when he smiled. But I was not painting his eyes." She paused. "I was trying to keep him in the room with me." The workshop was quiet, except for the ticking of the clocks on his shelf. Dozens of them, all keeping time, all moving forward at exactly the pace they were meant to. "The strange thing," she said softly, "is that he did not leave the room when I stopped painting. He was already here." She touched her chest lightly with her paint-stained hand. "He was always here. The painting was never what held him." After she left, the watchmaker sat for a long time without touching his tools. The afternoon light moved in a slow arc across the table. The clocks ticked their steady, overlapping rhythms. The tea cooled on the hot plate behind him, and at some point, he could not have said exactly when, he placed the velvet pouch back in the drawer and closed it gently, not with the heaviness of giving up, but with the tenderness of someone finally setting down a weight they had carried so long they had forgotten what their hands felt like without it. An old Zen saying suggests that you cannot hold 2 stones in one fist without losing the use of your hand. Perhaps that is all letting go has ever been, not losing what we love, but freeing the hand that loves it. There is a tree that grows in the mountains of certain cold countries, a kind of birch that holds its dead leaves all through winter, while every other tree stands bare and clean against the snow. This one clutches its brown, papery leaves in tight fists of branch and twig. They rattle in the wind. They block the snow from settling on the bark. They crowd the space where new buds are trying to form just beneath the surface. The tree does not hold on because the dead leaves are useful. It holds on because the signal to release has not yet come from within. The letting go happens only when the new growth underneath pushes firmly enough to break the old grip from the inside, not through force, but through readiness. No one tells the tree to open its hands. No one strips the branches bare. One morning quietly, the leaves are simply gone. And by afternoon, the first green point of a new bud has already begun to unfold in the place where the old leaf used to be. The tree did not lose anything. It only made room. Zen master Shunryu Suzuki once told his students that the best way to control a cow is to give it a large meadow. He was not talking about farming. He was talking about the mind. The tighter you hold it, the more it fights. The more you try to pin it down, to force it into stillness, into order, into the shape you think it should take, the more it bucks and twists and exhausts you both. But give it space. Give it room to wander. Let it go where it goes, without chasing it, without scolding it, without building fences out of frustration. And something remarkable happens. It slows down on its own. It finds its own quiet corner. It lies down in the grass, not because you made it, but because there was finally enough room for it to want to. Perhaps tonight the meadow is this room, and the cow is whatever your mind has been doing all day, racing, circling, doubling back, refusing to be still. You do not need to chase it. You do not need to build a smaller pen. You only need to leave the gate open and let the meadow do what meadows do. The space is the kindness. The openness is the discipline. And somewhere in all that room, the wandering slows, and the breathing deepens, and the body begins to remember what it knew before the mind started giving orders. You know this holding. You may be doing it right now without realizing it. The jaw clenched just slightly, the shoulders drawn up toward the ears, the mind circling back to something it cannot change. A word spoken too quickly, a door that closed before you were ready, a version of tomorrow that has not happened yet and may never happen at all. The Buddha once observed that we suffer not because life is painful, but because we grip what is passing through. He did not say it as a scolding. He said it the way a friend might say, "You have been carrying that bag for a very long time. Would you like to set it down?" Perhaps as you lie here now, you can feel where the holding lives in your body. Not everywhere, just one place. Maybe the hands, maybe the space behind the eyes, maybe the chest, where something has been sitting quietly all day, waiting to be noticed. You do not need to push it away. You do not need to fix it or name it or understand it. You only need to feel it, and perhaps, in feeling it, you will notice that it has already begun to loosen. The way a fist softens when it forgets why it was clenching in the first place. Pema Chödrön once said that nothing ever goes away until it has taught us what we need to know. Perhaps tonight is not about forcing anything open. Perhaps it is simply about being still enough to hear what the holding has been trying to tell you. Let us rest here for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the weight of your body against whatever is holding you. Notice what has already begun to soften since we started this journey together. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is another thread I would like to follow tonight. It has to do with the things we carry from yesterday, the conversations we keep replaying, the moments we keep trying to rewrite. It begins with a very old bridge and a young monk who could not stop looking back in a valley where the river ran wide and slow. There was a bridge made of stone so old that no one in the village could say who had built it. The stones were worn smooth by centuries of feet and rain, and moss grew in the cracks between them in soft green lines that followed the curve of the arch. Beneath the bridge the water moved without hurry, dark and heavy, with the silt it carried down from the mountains. You could hear it if you stood still long enough, Not a rush, not a roar, just a low, steady sound, like breathing. In the early morning, before anyone crossed, the bridge belonged to the mist. It would sit there in the grey light, looking as though it led not to the other side of the river, but to some other, quieter world entirely. Swallows nested in the underside of the arch, and their calls echoed off the water in thin, high notes that seemed to hang in the air long after the birds had gone. A young monk had come to the monastery on the hill above the village 6 months earlier. He was earnest and careful, the kind of person who folds his robe 3 times before setting it down, and who sweeps the courtyard long after the last leaf has been cleared. He kept his small room immaculate. The sleeping mat rolled tightly against the wall, the water cup placed at the exact center of the wooden shelf, the single candle always trimmed to the same height. But he had a habit the older monks had noticed. Every evening, after the last meditation bell, he would walk down to the bridge and stand in the middle of it, looking back toward the road that led south. The road he had traveled to arrive here. The road that led back to the life he had left behind. He had been a clerk in a port town before he came to the monastery. He had a desk near a window that overlooked the harbor, and he used to watch the boats come and go while he copied numbers into a leather-bound ledger. The ink smelled of iron, and his fingertips were always faintly blue. He had a woman he loved, or thought he loved, though they had never said so to each other directly. They would walk along the harbor wall on Sundays, and she would point at the gulls wheeling over the fish market and give them names, serious names, formal names, as though the birds were diplomats arriving at a summit, and he would laugh even though the names were never funny. It was the earnestness of the naming that he loved. The way she treated small, useless things as though they mattered. One evening she told him she was leaving the town to care for her mother in another province. She said she did not know when she would return. She said it in the same quiet voice she used to name the birds, and he realized later that this was her way of saying she was not coming back. He had come to the monastery because the town felt empty after she left. Not because he had found some deep calling towards silence or stillness. He had simply run out of places to look for her. The abbot was a woman in her 70s, with a face like folded linen, and a way of looking at people that made them feel she already knew what they were about to say. She had watched the young monk walk to the bridge every evening for 6 months without commenting. One night she followed him. She stood beside him for a long while without speaking. The river moved below them, black and smooth. Frogs called from the reeds on the far bank. The air was cool and smelled of wet stone and the wild mint that grew along the water's edge. "What do you see when you look down that road?" she asked. "I see the life I used to have," he said. "Do you? Or do you see the life you have decided it should have been?" He frowned. "I do not understand." "The woman you think about, when you remember her, do you remember the arguments? The silences that lasted 3 days? The morning you woke up and felt quietly relieved she was not beside you?" He was quiet for a long moment. The river kept moving beneath them. "No," he admitted softly. "I only remember the good parts." "That is what the past does," she said. "It edits itself. It removes the weight and keeps only the shine. And then we stand on bridges in the dark, longing for a place that never quite existed the way we remember it." She placed her hand on the stone railing, her fingers resting in a groove worn by thousands of other hands. The Buddha spoke of this, the way the mind builds a version of what was and then mistakes it for what is. He called it a kind of thirst, not for water, for something the mind has constructed and now believes it cannot live without. The young monk looked down at the water. Then, what am I supposed to do with the memory? Let it be a memory, she said simply. Not a room you keep returning to. Not a door you keep trying to open. A memory is a painting on a wall. You can look at it. You can feel something when you see it, but you cannot climb inside it. And the moment you try, you stop seeing the room you are actually standing in. He stood there for a long time after she walked back up the hill. The mist was beginning to rise off the water in slow, curling shapes. Somewhere on the far bank, a lantern flickered in a farmhouse window, small and orange and steady, and for the first time since he had arrived at the monastery, he turned away from the southern road and walked back up the hill without looking over his shoulder. The sound of the river followed him for a while, then faded, then was replaced by the sound of his own feet on the stone steps, carrying him forward. What the abbot had pointed toward, gently, without giving it a heavy name, is something the Buddha returned to again and again throughout his teaching. The word he used was upadana, which means clinging, not in a dramatic sense. Simply the way a doctor might say to a patient, "You are gripping the railing, and your knuckles have gone white, and the railing is not going anywhere. You can let go." Tonight, if you find your mind drifting backward, toward a conversation that ended badly, a home you no longer live in, a version of your life that closed its door quietly without asking your permission, you are not doing anything wrong. The mind drifts backward. That is what minds do. It is not a flaw. It is simply the mind doing the only thing it knows how to do with something it misses. It replays it, hoping that this time the ending will be different. Shunryu Suzuki once said that the mind that dwells in the past is like someone trying to walk forward while looking through a rearview mirror. You do not crash because the past is dangerous. You simply cannot see where you are going. And the present, this breath, this moment, this quiet room where you are resting right now, slips by unnoticed, like a landscape passing outside a window that no one is looking through. The past is not a place you failed to hold on to. It is a place that finished. And the finishing was not a loss. It was a door that closed so quietly you almost did not hear it, so that the one you are standing in front of right now might finally open. There is a river not far from here, or perhaps it is far, but it does not matter, because all rivers teach the same lesson if you sit beside them long enough. This particular river runs through a valley where the trees lean over the water so closely that in autumn their leaves fall directly onto the current and are carried away without hesitation. The leaves do not struggle. They do not reach back toward the branch. They simply land on the surface and move with whatever the water is doing, spinning in an eddy, gliding through a straight stretch, tumbling gently over a shallow ledge of stone. If you sit on the bank and watch for an hour, you will see hundreds of leaves make this journey, and not one of them will try to go back upstream. They do not need to decide to let go. The branch lets go of them, and the river receives them, and the journey that follows is not a tragedy. It is simply what happens next. Perhaps tonight you are the leaf. Perhaps the branch has already opened so gently you did not even feel it happen. And perhaps the river beneath you, this voice, this darkness, this slow unwinding hour, is not taking you away from anything. It is simply carrying you forward, the way rivers carry everything they hold, without effort, without opinion, without looking back, toward the rest that has been waiting for you all along, patient and still, like a lake at the end of a valley that has nowhere else to be. There was a woman who made bread in a bakery that had belonged to her family for 3 generations. The ovens were old brick, blackened by decades of heat, and they held warmth long after the fires had died down. She would arrive at 4 in the morning, when the street was still dark, and the only sound was the hum of the cooling fans and the distant bark of a dog somewhere in the neighborhood. The flour dust hung in the air like fog, and it settled on everything. The counters, her apron, the fine hairs on her forearms. Her hands were strong and cracked at the knuckles from years of kneading, and she moved through the kitchen with the kind of certainty that comes from doing the same motions 10,000 times. Her mother had run the bakery before her, and her grandmother before that. There were photographs on the wall near the register, black and white, then color, then faded color, showing 3 women in the same apron, standing behind the same counter, smiling the same careful smile. The recipes had not changed. The bread was the same bread. The customers came because they remembered the taste from when they were children, and their children came because they had been told this was the place. But the woman's mother had died 2 years ago, and since then something in the bakery had shifted. Not the bread was still good. Something else. Something in the air, something in the way the morning felt when she unlocked the door alone. She found herself pausing at odd moments, standing in front of the ovens with her hands at her sides, staring at the bricks as if they might speak. She would catch herself arranging the loaves on the shelf, the way her mother used to. Tilted, slightly left, the round ones in front, and then stopping, wondering whether she was baking bread or performing a ritual for someone who could no longer see it. One morning, her apprentice, a quiet young man who had been with her for a year, found her sitting on the flour sacks in the storeroom, not crying, just sitting, with a ball of dough in her lap that had gone cold. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I keep making her bread," she said. "Every morning, the same recipes, the same order, the same way she folded the towels." He sat down across from her on an upturned crate. "Is that a bad thing?" "I do not know. I think I am afraid that if I change anything, if I try a new recipe, if I rearrange the shelves, it will mean she is really gone." The young man was quiet for a while. He picked at a thread on his apron. "My grandfather built boats," he said. "After he died, my father kept his workshop exactly the way it was. The tools in the same places. The half-finished hull still on the sawhorses. For 5 years, nothing moved. And then, one day my father walked in and started building his own boat. Different design, different wood. He said it was the hardest thing he ever did. But he also said it was the first morning in 5 years that he felt like his father was actually with him. Not as a ghost he was trying to preserve, but as someone who had taught him enough to let him build something new." The woman looked down at the cold dough in her hands. The storeroom smelled of yeast and burlap, and the faint sweetness of dried fruit stored in jars on the top shelf. "Maybe that is what she would want," the woman said slowly. "Not the same bread forever, just someone who learned enough from her to keep going." The next morning, for the first time in 2 years, she arrived at the bakery and did not follow her mother's recipe list. She made something new, a dark rye with caraway seeds and a touch of honey that she had been thinking about for months, but had never allowed herself to try. When it came out of the oven, it smelled different from anything the bakery had ever produced. She stood there holding the warm loaf in a towel, and she was not sure whether she wanted to laugh or cry, so she did neither. She just breathed in the smell of it, and then she placed it on the shelf, not tilted left, not in the front, but right in the center, where it could be the first thing anyone saw when they walked through the door. Dogen, the great Zen teacher, once wrote that to study the self is to forget the self, and to forget the self is to be awakened by all things. Perhaps forgetting in this sense does not mean erasing. It means loosening the grip just enough to let the world back in. There is an old parable about two monks crossing a river. They came to the bank and found a woman standing at the edge, afraid to cross because the current was strong. The older monk picked her up without a word, carried her across, and set her down on the other side. She thanked him and went on her way. The two monks walked in silence for an hour. Then the younger monk said, "We are not supposed to touch women. How could you carry her?" The older monk looked at him calmly and said, "I set her down at the river. You are still carrying her. Perhaps tonight there is something you set down a long time ago, but your mind has not yet heard the news. Perhaps there is a river crossing that ended hours or years ago, and yet some part of you is still standing on the bank, holding a weight that the water has already washed away. You do not need to put it down with force. You do not need to decide anything tonight. Perhaps you only need to notice that your arms are tired and that the river, whenever you are ready, has already moved on. And perhaps that is enough for now. Let us rest here for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice the places where your body has begun to grow heavier, not with burden, but with the kind of heaviness that comes before rest. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is a quieter thread waiting for us now. It has to do not with the past or the future, but with a much closer weight, the one that whispers you are not quite good enough. It begins in a pottery workshop, on a morning when the rain would not stop. The pottery workshop sat at the end of a narrow lane, where the cobblestones were always wet, even in summer, because the buildings on either side leaned so close together that the sun could only reach the ground for about 20 minutes each afternoon. The walls of the workshop were thick and cool, made of old plaster that had cracked and been repaired so many times. It looked like a map of rivers seen from very high up. Inside, the air smelled of wet clay and the faint mineral sharpness of glaze powder, and everything, the shelves, the wheel, the stool, the edges of the windows, was dusted with a fine grey film that never quite went away, no matter how carefully it was wiped. On rainy days, the dampness made the clay easier to work, and the wheel turned with a softer sound, and the whole room felt like the inside of something living, warm and close, and full of the smell of earth. A man had been making bowls in this workshop for nearly 30 years. Not cups, not vases, not decorative pieces for shop windows. Just bowls. Simple, round, ordinary bowls meant for holding rice or soup or tea. He had learned the craft from a teacher who had told him on the very first day that a good bowl is one you forget you are holding. Not beautiful in a way that demands attention, beautiful in a way that disappears into the act of eating, of drinking, of sitting at a table with people you love. The beauty should be so quiet that the person using the bowl never thinks about the bowl at all. He had taken this teaching seriously, perhaps more seriously than his teacher had intended. The problem was that he could not stop correcting. Every bowl that came off the wheel looked, to his eye, slightly wrong. The rim was a fraction too thick on one side. The curve of the belly was not quite symmetrical. The glaze pooled unevenly in one corner, or the color fired a shade darker than he had planned. He would hold each finished bowl up to the light from the window and turn it slowly in his rough hands, looking for the flaw he knew was there. And when he found it, and he always found it, he would set the bowl aside on the back shelf and start again. That shelf was lined with bowls he had rejected, dozens of them, rows and rows of almost perfect things gathering dust, things that no one would ever eat from, or drink from, or hold in their hands on a cold morning, because the man who made them could not stop seeing what was wrong with them. His daughter, who was 12 and liked to sit on a wooden stool in the corner and draw pictures of the orange cat that slept on the warm kiln, had stopped asking if she could use one of the rejected bowls for her breakfast. The answer was always the same. Not that one. It is not right yet. On a morning when the rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, and the lane outside had become a shallow stream that carried leaves and petals past the workshop door, an old woman came inside. She was not a customer. She was a neighbor who lived 2 doors down and made her living mending clothes. Her hands were small and quick, and always had a thimble mark on the right index finger. She had come to ask if he had a bowl she could borrow, because hers had broken that morning when it slipped from her wet hands onto the kitchen tiles. He gestured toward the shelf of rejects. "Take any one you like." She walked along the row slowly, running her finger across the rims the way someone might run a hand along a fence, feeling each post. She picked up a bowl that was slightly lopsided, with a glaze that had run thin on one side, leaving a pale streak across the dark surface like a brushstroke of unexpected light. "This one," she said. He winced. "That one has a flaw. The glaze did not set evenly. I can find you a better one. There is one near the end that is closer to what I intended." She held the bowl up and turned it in her weathered hands. The rain tapped softly against the window. The cat stretched on the warm kiln, yawned, and settled back into sleep. "I have been mending clothes for 40 years, she said. "Do you know what I have learned in all that time? Every piece of fabric has a grain, a direction it wants to go. If you fight the grain, the thread snaps and you have to start over. But if you follow it, if you let the needle go where the cloth wants to take it, the mend becomes part of the garment. It disappears. You cannot even see it anymore." She looked down at the bowl again, turning it so the pale streak caught the grey light from the window. "This streak here, where the glaze ran thin, it does not make the bowl worse. It makes it look like it was touched by something, like the light found it before you did." "It was a mistake," he said flatly. "Yes," she said, "and the best things usually are." She tucked the bowl under her arm and walked back out into the rain. He watched her through the window as she made her way up the lane. Her shoulders hunched against the water, the lopsided bowl held close to her chest, like something fragile and worth keeping. His daughter looked up from her drawing. "I like that bowl too," she said quietly. He did not answer, but that evening, after the wheel had stopped turning and the workshop was quiet, except for the cat purring on the cooling kiln, he picked up another of the rejected bowls from the shelf. This one had a rim that was slightly uneven, a gentle wave in the clay that he had spent 20 minutes trying to smooth before giving up in frustration. He filled the bowl with tea. He sat on his stool by the window. He drank from it slowly, both hands wrapped around its warmth, and for the first time he noticed that the place where his lip met the rim, right at the spot where the wave dipped lowest, felt exactly right, as though the bowl had been waiting all this time for someone to stop correcting it and simply use it. The Buddha once said that the root of suffering is the belief that this moment should be other than it is. He did not say it to a potter, but he might as well have. You know this pattern. You may be carrying it right now, even as you lie here in the dark. The quiet voice that reviews the day and finds it lacking. The mental list of things you should have said more carefully, done with more grace, handled with less haste. The steady, familiar feeling that somewhere between who you are and who you believe you should be, there is a gap, and that the gap is your fault. An old Zen teacher once said that the flower does not compete with the flower next to it. It simply blooms. Perhaps you are not a flawed version of someone better. Perhaps you are a bowl with a streak of light in a place no one expected, and the only thing missing is someone willing to drink from you exactly as you are. There is an old story about a calligrapher who spent 40 years trying to paint the perfect circle. Every morning he would lay out his paper, grind his ink, lift his brush, and in one continuous motion, draw a circle. He did this thousands of times, tens of thousands. His students would watch in silence as circle after circle appeared on the paper. Some too thin on one side, some slightly flattened at the top, some wobbling, where the brush hesitated for a fraction of a breath. He would study each one, shake his head, and set it aside. One day, when he was very old and his hand trembled and his eyesight had begun to dim, he drew a circle that was unmistakably imperfect. The line wavered. The shape was not quite closed at the top. The ink was thicker on the left, where his hand had pressed too hard. He looked at it for a long time. Then he smiled. For the first time, his students said in all the years they had known him. "There it is," he said. He hung it on the wall above his desk, and he never painted another circle again. When a student asked him what had changed, he said simply, "I stopped trying to draw a perfect circle. I drew a true one instead." Perhaps perfection was never the destination. Perhaps it was the wall standing between us and the truer, braver thing, the thing that shakes, the thing that wobbles, the thing that dares to be seen exactly as it is. In a school on the outskirts of a town, where the houses thinned out and the fields began, there was a music teacher who had once been a concert pianist. Her studio was a small room at the back of the building, with a single window that looked out onto a row of poplars. The piano was old and slightly out of tune in the highest register, and the bench wobbled if you shifted your weight too quickly. But she had placed a folded cloth beneath the short leg, and it held steady enough. The room smelled of lemon wood polish and the chalk dust that drifted in from the corridor. And in the late afternoon, the light came through the poplars in long golden bars that moved across the floor as the wind turned the leaves. She had performed in concert halls in her 20s and 30s. She had played in front of audiences who held their breath when she played and released it only when the last note faded. She had recordings. She kept them in a box in her closet, never listened to them, because somewhere in her 40s, her left hand had begun to stiffen, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone in the audience would have noticed. But she noticed. A trill that used to ripple like water now caught slightly, like a zipper snagging on fabric. A run that used to flow without thought now required a half-second of extra concentration. And that half-second was enough. It was enough to turn every performance from something joyful into something she was trying to survive. She had stopped performing. She told people it was because she wanted to teach. But the truth, which she had only ever said out loud once, to her sister on a night when they had both had too much wine, was simpler than that. She could not bear to be less than what she had been. Her students did not know any of this. They knew her as the teacher who never raised her voice, who would listen to a child play the same passage badly 7 times, and then say, with genuine warmth, "That is getting closer. Let us try once more." They did not know that what she was teaching them was something she was still trying to learn herself. One afternoon, a girl of about 9 was struggling with a simple piece. She kept stopping in the middle, shaking her head, going back to the beginning. Her small fingers were tense, curled too tightly over the keys. "I keep making mistakes," the girl said, her voice thin with frustration. The teacher sat down beside her on the wobbling bench. "Play it again," she said. "But this time, when you make a mistake, do not stop. Keep going. Play through it. But it will sound wrong. It will sound human," the teacher said, "which is different from wrong." The girl played. She stumbled in the 3rd measure winced but kept going. She missed a note in the fifth measure, and her left hand landed on the wrong key in the seventh. But she did not stop. When she reached the end, she looked up, surprised. "That is the first time you have ever finished the piece," the teacher said quietly. The girl stared at the keys. But it was full of mistakes. Yes, and it was also whole. A thing does not have to be perfect to be complete. It only has to be played all the way through. That evening, after the students had gone, and the building was empty, and the poplars outside had gone dark against the last purple light of the sky, the teacher sat down at the piano alone. She placed her hands on the keys. She could feel the stiffness in her left hand. Familiar now, a companion she had not chosen, but could no longer pretend was not there. She began to play, not a concert piece, not something meant for an audience, just a nocturne she had loved when she was young, before the stiffness, before the fear. She played it slowly. Her left hand caught in two places. The trill was not what it once was, but she did not stop. She played all the way through to the end. And when the last note faded into the empty room, she sat there with her hands still on the keys and her eyes closed. And she felt something she had not felt in years. Not perfection, just completeness. Just the quiet dignity of a thing that had been played all the way to its end. Pema Chödrön once said that we think the point is to pass the test or overcome the problem. But the truth is that things do not really get solved. They come together and they fall apart. Then they come together again and fall apart again. The healing is in the return, not in the arriving. There is something the Japanese call kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. When a bowl cracks, instead of hiding the damage or throwing the piece away, the potter fills the fracture with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The break becomes a bright seam running across the surface, visible, beautiful, permanent. The bowl is not restored to what it was before. It becomes something new. Something that wears its history openly. Something that says, "I was broken, and the breaking made me more interesting than I ever was when I was whole." Perhaps tonight, as you lie here, you can let the cracks be, the things you said that were not quite right, the places where the day split open, and you could not hold it together. You do not need to mend them invisibly. You do not need to pretend they did not happen. Perhaps the only thing left to do tonight is to stop trying to be the person you think you should have been today, and simply rest as the person you actually were. That person is enough. That person was always enough. And perhaps your body already knows this, even if your mind has not caught up yet. Perhaps your shoulders have already dropped a little lower than they were when we began. Perhaps the jaw has softened. Perhaps somewhere behind the eyes, a small knot of tension has begun to loosen without anyone asking it to. You are not doing this. Your body is simply remembering what it feels like to stop performing. Let us pause here. Let the breath come as it wants to come. There is no right way to breathe tonight. There is only your way. When you are ready, we will continue together. The next story takes us somewhere different, not into the workshop or the studio, but into the hours between midnight and morning, where the mind likes to rehearse tomorrow as though it were a play it might fail to perform. It begins with a fisherman who could not sleep. There is a particular kind of tiredness that does not come from the body. It comes from the mind rehearsing. You know it, even if you have never named it. It is the tiredness of lying awake at 2 in the morning, running through tomorrow, as though it were a script you have not memorized. What will you say in the meeting? How will you handle the conversation you have been avoiding? What happens if the test comes back wrong? If the money does not arrive? If the call never comes? The body is still. The body wants to sleep, but the mind is pacing the hallways of a house that has not been built yet, checking the locks on doors that do not exist. The Buddha once called this kind of thinking papancha, the mind's habit of taking one small worry and spinning it into an entire world. Not a world that is real. A world made entirely of what if. There is a very old story about a farmer who bought a horse. His neighbor came over and said, "What good fortune." The farmer said, "Perhaps." The next week, the horse ran away. The neighbor said, "What terrible luck." The farmer said, "Perhaps." A few days later, the horse returned, bringing with it 3 wild horses. "What wonderful fortune," the neighbor said. "Perhaps," said the farmer. The following week, the farmer's son tried to ride one of the wild horses, fell and broke his leg. "How awful," said the neighbor. "Perhaps," said the farmer. The week after that, the army came through the village, conscripting young men for war, and the farmer's son was passed over because of his broken leg. The neighbor opened his mouth to speak, but this time he said nothing. He was beginning to understand. The story is not about luck. It is about the mind's need to finish the sentence before the sentence is done. We look at this moment and we rush to write the next chapter, and we almost always write the wrong one. The future, every time we try to visit it, turns out to be a country whose maps are drawn in disappearing ink. There was a fisherman who lived in a small house at the end of a dock that extended out over a bay, where the water was shallow and green and calm on most days. The house was barely more than a shack. 1 room, a wood stove, a window that faced the water, and a bed built into the wall like a shelf. The wood of the walls had gone silver from years of salt air, and the whole structure creaked gently when the tide changed, as though it were breathing with the sea. Nets hung drying on hooks outside the door, and they swayed in the wind and cast tangled shadows on the dock planks in the late afternoon light. The air always smelled of brine and engine oil, and the faintly sweet rot of seaweed drying on the rocks below. He had fished this bay for 25 years. He knew where the schools ran in each season, which currents carried bait, and which carried only cold, where the bottom dropped off, and where the rocks hid just below the surface, waiting to tear a net. He was good at what he did. His hands were thick and scarred and competent, and the other fishermen in the bay respected him, not because he talked about his skill, but because he did not need to. But lately he could not sleep. It had started 6 months ago, when a large commercial trawler had begun working the outer edge of the bay. The trawler took everything, swept the bottom clean, left nothing behind. The smaller fishermen had watched their catches shrink week by week. Some had already given up and gone to work in the canning factory on the mainland. The fisherman on the dock had not given up, but at night, lying in his shelf bed, with the sound of the water lapping beneath the floor, his mind would begin its rehearsal. What if the catches keep dropping? What if the trawler moves closer? What if the bay dies the way the bay to the north had died 3 years ago? What if he loses the dock? What if he has to sell the boat? The boat his father had built by hand 30 years ago. The boat that still smelled, on warm days, faintly of the cedar his father had planed and sanded and sealed with his own rough hands. He would lie there, constructing entire futures in the dark. Futures where the bay was empty. Futures where the dock was sold and the house torn down, and he was standing in a concrete room in a factory, packing fish he had not caught into cans he did not own. Each future was worse than the last. Each one felt real, and by morning he would be exhausted, not from work, but from living 3 or 4 terrible lives before the sun had even come up. One evening he was sitting on the edge of the dock, with his feet hanging over the water, when an old woman who sold dried fish at the morning market, sat down beside him. She was small and brown from decades in the sun, and she had a way of being silent that felt more like company than most people's talking. "You look like a man who has been somewhere far away," she said. "I have not left the dock in 3 days." "I did not say you left the dock. I said you have been far away. There is a difference." He looked at her. The water moved beneath them in slow, rocking swells. "I cannot stop thinking about what is going to happen," he said. "And what is going to happen? I do not know. That is the problem." She laughed, a short, dry sound, like a match striking. "That has always been the problem. Since the first fisherman pushed the first boat into the first water, none of them knew what was going to happen either. And yet, here we are. Boats still going out, fish still coming in, not always, not forever, but today." She reached into her bag and pulled out a piece of dried fish, tore it in half, and handed him the larger piece. "Eat this. It is today's fish. Tomorrow's fish does not exist yet. You cannot eat a fish that has not been caught. You cannot lose a boat that is still tied to your dock. And you cannot sleep in a bed that your mind has already given away to a landlord who has not been born." He chewed the fish slowly. It was salty and tough, and tasted like the bay on a good morning. "My grandmother used to say something," the old woman continued. She would say, "Worry is interest, paid on a debt that may never come due." I did not understand her when I was young. I thought she was being foolish, but she outlived every person who called her foolish, and she slept like a stone every night of her life. There is a cat, you may have seen one like it, that lives in a garden and spends its afternoons lying in whatever patch of sunlight happens to be available. When the sun moves, the cat moves. Not anxiously, not with any sense of urgency or loss. It simply opens one eye, notices that the warm spot has shifted 3 feet to the left, stands up, stretches with the slow thoroughness of something that has nowhere else to be, walks to the new patch of light, and lies down again. It does not worry about where the sun will be in an hour. It does not grieve the patch of warmth it just left. It does not plan for clouds. It simply follows the warmth, moment by moment, with a kind of trust that most humans spend their entire lives trying to learn and never quite manage. The Buddha did not talk about cats, as far as we know, but if he had, he might have pointed at one lying in the sun and said, "There, that is what I have been trying to explain." Not the laziness, not the napping, the trust, the willingness to be exactly where the warmth is, without reaching for where it was, or worrying about where it will go. That is the entire teaching. The rest is commentary. We complicate it, of course, we always do. We build elaborate plans to protect ourselves from futures that may never arrive. We construct shelters against storms that exist only in the forecast of our own anxiety. And meanwhile, the sun is here, the warmth is here, the patch of light is right beneath us, exactly where we are standing, and we are too busy scanning the horizon to look down and feel it on our skin. The cat does not do this. The cat has no horizon. The cat has only now, this square of warmth, this particular angle of afternoon light, this slow blink, this breath, and now is always, always enough. The fisherman sat with the taste of salt on his tongue and the sound of the water beneath him, and the old woman's words, settling into a place he did not know was empty. He looked out across the bay. The trawler was there, far out near the horizon, its lights blinking against the darkening sky. It was still there, the problem was still there, but somehow, sitting on the dock with half a dried fish in his hand, the problem felt like it had moved back to its actual size, large. Yes, but not the size of the entire world, not the size his mind had made it at 3 in the morning. "I should go to bed," he said. Yes, the old woman said. And when you get there, stay in it. Do not go traveling to places that have not invited you. He walked back into his small house. The stove was warm. The bed was waiting. The water rocked gently beneath the floor. And that night, for the first time in months, he fell asleep before his mind could take him somewhere else. Not because the future had changed, but because he had, for one evening, stopped trying to live there before it arrived. There was a different kind of person who understood this teaching from the other side. Not someone who had to learn it, but someone who seemed to have been born knowing it, the way some people are born knowing how to swim. She was a weaver who lived alone in a house on the edge of a forest, where birch trees grew so close together that in summer the light came through them, green and moving, as though the air itself were made of water. Her loom sat by the largest window, a heavy wooden frame strung with threads so fine they looked like rain frozen in mid-air. The floor around it was scattered with scraps of yarn, in colors she had dyed herself. Indigo from woad, yellow from onion skins, a deep brownish red from walnut hulls soaked in iron water. The room smelled of wet wool and wood ash, and the sharp green scent of the birch leaves that pressed against the window glass when the wind blew. She wove slowly, not because she lacked skill. Her fingers moved with the assurance of someone who has made the same motions for decades, but because she believed that cloth should not be rushed. She would work for 2 or 3 hours each morning, then stop, regardless of how much she had finished. She would make tea, walk in the forest, sit on her porch, and watch the light change in the birch canopy overhead. Neighbors who came to buy her cloth sometimes asked how she could be so calm when she had orders waiting. "The cloth will be ready when the cloth is ready," she would say. Pulling on a thread does not make it longer. A young man from the village came to her one autumn because he had heard she was wise, though she would never have used that word for herself. He was about to be married, and he was terrified. Not of the marriage itself. He loved the woman he was going to marry. He was terrified of everything that might come after. What if they could not afford the house? What if they argued and could not find their way back? What if he turned out to be the kind of father his own father had been? Distant, distracted, always somewhere else in his mind. The weaver listened without interrupting. When he finished, she walked to her loom and pointed at the cloth she was working on. It was half done, the pattern visible on the completed half, the empty threads waiting on the other. "What do you see?" she asked. "Half a cloth," he said. "And what is on the other half?" "Nothing yet." "Exactly, nothing yet. You are standing here, trying to see the pattern on a part of the cloth that has not been woven. You are squinting at empty threads and trying to read a design that does not exist." She ran her hand across the finished portion. "This part is real. You can touch it. You can see the colors. You can feel where the weave is tight and where I let it breathe. But this other part," she gestured at the bare threads, "this part is only thread. It has no pattern yet, and no amount of worrying will make one appear. The pattern comes from the weaving, not from the waiting." He looked at the half-finished cloth for a long time. The birch leaves tapped against the window. A single strand of spider silk caught the light near the top of the loom, thin as a thought. "So I just start," he said. "You just start, and you pay attention to the thread in your hand, not the thread at the end of the loom." Thich Nhat Hanh once said that the present moment is the only moment available to us, and it is the door to all moments. Perhaps tonight, as you lie here, the door is already open. Perhaps you have been standing in front of it, looking past it, trying to see what is in the next room and the room after that. But the door is here, and what is on the other side of it is not tomorrow. It is simply the next breath. If you notice your mind beginning to reach forward, toward the alarm clock, toward the morning, toward the list of things that will need your attention when the sun comes up, you do not need to pull it back. Just notice where it has gone. And then gently return to the sound of this voice. Return to the feeling of whatever is beneath you. The pillow, the blanket, the mattress, holding the full weight of your body, without complaint. That is enough. That is the only thread you need to hold right now. Let us rest here for a moment. Feel how the night has deepened around you. Feel how the body has grown heavier since we began. Not with worry, but with the kind of heaviness that means rest is near. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is one more place I would like to take you tonight. It has to do with the arguments we carry, not the ones we win, but the ones we refuse to set down, even when they have long since stopped mattering. It begins on a rainy afternoon, in a tea shop that smelled of jasmine and old wood. The tea shop was on a street so narrow that if you stretched your arms out, you could almost touch both walls. It had been there for longer than anyone could remember. The kind of place that seems to have grown out of the ground rather than been built. With dark wooden beams that had warped over the decades into soft curves, and a floor that dipped in the middle where 1,000 feet had worn it down. The walls were lined with shelves holding ceramic jars of tea, each one labeled in faded brushstrokes, and the air was thick with the smell of jasmine and roasted barley and something older, something that lived in the wood itself. The accumulated scent of 100 years of steam and leaves and quiet conversation. A single lantern hung from the ceiling on a chain that had gone green with age, and it cast a circle of warm orange light that did not quite reach the corners of the room, leaving them in a soft, comfortable darkness. The owner was a man in his 60s who moved behind the counter with the unhurried grace of someone who has poured 10,000 cups of tea and has come to understand that the pouring is not a task, but a kind of meditation. His hands were steady and deliberate. He never spilled. He never rushed. He would set the cup in front of you and then step back, as though giving the tea a moment to introduce itself. On a rainy afternoon in late autumn, 2 men came into the shop and sat at the table nearest the window. They were brothers. You could see it in the shape of their faces, the same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes, though everything else about them suggested they had spent their adult lives moving in opposite directions. One was a carpenter. His hands were broad and rough, with sawdust caught in the creases of his knuckles, and he wore a canvas jacket stained with wood oil. The other was an accountant. His hands were pale and clean, his shirt pressed, his shoes polished despite the rain outside. They had not spoken to each other in 2 years. The reason was a disagreement about their mother's care, whether she should move into a facility or stay in her home with hired help. The carpenter believed she should stay home. The accountant believed the facility was safer. Neither had been willing to bend, and the argument had calcified into something harder than either of them had intended. The way a small crack in a wall becomes a fissure if no one tends to it. They had agreed to meet today because their mother had asked them to. Not to resolve anything, just to sit in the same room. For the first 15 minutes, they talked about nothing. The weather, a road that was being repaired near the old school, the price of firewood this year. The tea shop owner brought them jasmine tea in 2 cups that did not match. One was pale green, the other a deep rust color, and set them down without comment. Then the carpenter said, "I still think she should stay home." And the accountant said, "I still think the facility is safer." And the silence that followed was so heavy, it seemed to press the lantern light down toward the table. The tea shop owner, who had been wiping the counter with a cloth, did not look up, but he spoke. "Would you like to hear something an old customer once told me?" he said. He was a judge. He sat in this shop every Thursday for 30 years. And one evening, after a particularly difficult case, he said something I have never forgotten. He said, "In 40 years on the bench, I have learned that being right is the most expensive thing a person can be. Not because the truth does not matter, but because the cost of holding on to it, when the person across from you is someone you love, is almost always higher than the cost of letting it go." The carpenter wrapped his hands around his cup. The accountant stared at the rain streaking down the window. "I am not saying either of you is wrong," the tea shop owner continued, folding his cloth neatly. "I am saying that the space between right and right is where most families break. Not between right and wrong. That one is easy. It is when both people are right, and neither can set their rightness down, that the crack becomes permanent." The carpenter looked at his brother. "I do not want to be right anymore," he said. "I just want to be your brother." The accountant did not answer right away. He picked up his cup, the rust-colored one, and turned it slowly in his clean hands. Outside, the rain had softened to a thin mist that blurred the street lamp across the road into a haze of gold. "I do not want to be right either," he said finally. "I just did not know how to stop." They sat there for another hour. They did not solve the question of their mother, but somewhere during that hour, neither of them could have said exactly when, the fissure between them began to close. Not because one of them surrendered, but because both of them at the same moment decided that the relationship was heavier than the argument, and that carrying both was no longer something they were willing to do. The Buddha once spoke about right speech, not as a set of rules for what to say, but as a practice of asking, before you speak, is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? And perhaps there is a fourth question the Buddha did not say out loud, but surely intended. Is it worth the distance it will create? There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being right. It is different from the exhaustion of work or worry or grief. It is the exhaustion of standing your ground on a piece of earth that keeps getting smaller. You are right, and you are alone on your small island, and the water is rising, and the person you love is standing on their own island across the channel, also right, also alone, also watching the water rise. Tonight, if there is someone you have been carrying an argument with, not in your hands but in your chest, in the place where your breath catches when you think of their name, you are not weak for wanting to set it down. The Buddha did not say that the truth does not matter. He said that clinging to the truth as a weapon is just another form of clinging. And clinging, no matter what we cling to, even rightness, even justice, even the best and most reasonable position, always leads to the same place: a closed fist, a tight jaw, a heart that has forgotten how to rest. Shunryu Suzuki once said that, in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few. Perhaps the same is true of arguments. In the beginning, there were many ways forward, but the longer we hold on, the fewer doors remain open, until finally we are standing in a room with no exits, clutching a truth that no longer has anywhere to go. There was a doctor who worked in a clinic at the edge of a small town where the paved road ended and the dirt road began. The clinic was a low concrete building with a tin roof that drummed loudly when it rained, and the waiting room had plastic chairs lined against the walls and a single ceiling fan that turned so slowly it seemed to be thinking carefully about each rotation before committing to it. The air smelled of antiseptic and the chalky sweetness of the powdered milk they kept in the back room for the children who came in underweight. Her desk was cluttered with files and half-empty cups of coffee that she forgot about as soon as she set them down, and the window behind her looked out onto a yard where a mango tree dropped its fruit onto the tin roof of the storage shed with a sound like someone knocking politely on a door. On hot afternoons, the shade from the mango tree was the only cool place for 100 meters, and the waiting patients would sit beneath it on upturned buckets, fanning themselves with folded clinic brochures, talking quietly or not talking at all. She had been a surgeon in the city before she came here. A good one, precise, confident, known for making decisions quickly and rarely being wrong. That quickness had served her well in the operating theater, where hesitation cost lives and certainty saved them. It had not served her well anywhere else. Her marriage had ended after 7 years, not because of anything dramatic, but because of the slow accumulation of 7 years of small corrections. She had corrected her husband's grammar at dinner parties, his driving on Sunday afternoons, the way he loaded the dishwasher, folded the towels, seasoned the soup, parked the car 6 inches too far from the curb. She was almost always right about the grammar and the driving and the dishwasher, and she was almost always alone with her rightness by the end of the conversation. He had not left in anger. He had left the way water leaves a glass with a crack in it, slowly, quietly, until one morning the glass was simply empty, and she could not say exactly when it had happened. She had come to the clinic 5 years ago, and somewhere in those 5 years, she could not have pointed to a single moment. She had begun to change. It was not the work itself that changed her, though the work was humbling in ways surgery never had been. It was the patients. It was the old farmer who came in every month with the same dangerously high blood pressure and the same calm refusal to take his medication, and who one day, when she asked him for the 3rd time why he would not take the pills, said simply, "Because they make me feel like I am not myself anymore." She had opened her mouth to explain the risks, the statistics, the irrationality of choosing identity over longevity, and then she had closed it because she realized, standing there with her clipboard and her certainty, that he was not being irrational at all. He was telling her something deeply true about his own experience that her medical training had not prepared her to hear. It was the young mother who brought in a baby with a fever and a home remedy smeared across the child's chest, a greenish paste made of herbs and wood ash that the grandmother had prepared according to a recipe passed down through generations. The doctor's first instinct was to wipe it off and deliver a firm lecture about evidence-based medicine. But something made her pause, a softness she did not recognize as her own. She asked about the paste instead. She asked what was in it. She asked whether the grandmother had used it before and for what. And the mother, who had been tensed for a scolding, softened visibly and began to talk, really talk, about her child, her fears, the long night she had spent watching the fever climb while the grandmother prepared the remedy by candlelight. The paste did nothing medically, but the conversation it opened did something the doctor's prescription alone could never have done. It built a bridge between 2 people who had been standing on opposite sides of the same concern. She learned, over the years at the clinic, that being right was a kind of door that only opened inward. You could stand behind it and feel safe, feel certain, feel justified. But no one could reach you there, and the moment you stepped out from behind it, the moment you said, "I hear you," or "Tell me more," or "Perhaps you are seeing something I cannot see," the room suddenly had space in it for 2 people instead of one. That was the surgery she had needed all along. Not on anyone's body, on her own certainty. An old Zen teacher once observed that the bamboo that bends in the wind does not break, while the oak that stands rigid is torn out of the earth. Strength is not always the same thing as stiffness. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is allow yourself to be moved. There is a story told in some traditions about a scholar who traveled a great distance to visit a famous teacher. When he arrived, the teacher invited him to sit and offered him tea. The scholar began immediately to talk about his degrees, his publications, his theories, his years of study, his deep and thorough understanding of philosophy. The teacher listened without expression and began to pour tea into the scholar's cup. The cup filled, the tea reached the brim, and the teacher kept pouring. Tea spilled over the rim, across the table, onto the scholar's robe, onto his lap. The scholar leaped up. "The cup is full," he cried. "No more can go in." The teacher set down the pot and looked at him calmly. "You are like this cup," he said gently. "How can I show you anything new if you have not first made room by emptying what you already carry? Perhaps tonight you are carrying a cup that has been full for a very long time, full of opinions you have defended, full of positions you have held so long they feel like part of your bones, full of the quiet, stubborn certainty that you have already figured out how this particular story ends. You do not need to empty the cup tonight. That is too much to ask of anyone at this hour. But perhaps you can set it down on the nightstand beside you. Just for now, just while you rest, and notice what your hands feel like when they are not gripping the handle. Perhaps right now your hands have already begun to soften. Perhaps you did not notice it happening. Perhaps the fingers uncurled on their own, the way they do when sleep draws close, and the body knows, before the mind does, that it is safe to stop holding on. Let us rest here for a moment. Take a slow breath. There is nowhere to be but here, and nothing to prove to anyone tonight, least of all to yourself. When you are ready, we will continue together. The next thread is a quieter one. It lives closer to the bone, in the voice inside your own head, the one that speaks the harshest words, the one that knows exactly where to aim, because it has lived inside you long enough to learn all of your tender places. It begins with a woman who walked the same path every morning, long before the rest of the town was awake. She walked the same path every morning. A loop that began at her front door, followed the canal for half a mile, crossed the old stone footbridge where the willows dipped their branches into the water, continued through the park, where the grass was always wet with dew at that hour, and returned along the high street, past the shuttered shops and the bakery that was just beginning to exhale the smell of bread into the cold air. She walked at the same pace every day, her hands pushed deep into the pockets of the same grey coat, her eyes fixed on the ground a few feet ahead of her, as though she were reading something written on the pavement that no one else could see. The walk took 40 minutes. She had timed it once, years ago, and now her body knew the rhythm so well that she could feel when she was running a minute behind, without looking at a clock. She walked in all weather. In rain, the canal turned dark and choppy, and the willows threw off droplets that caught the light from the street lamps like tiny falling stars. In winter, the path was sometimes icy, and she walked with smaller steps, her breath making clouds that dissolved in front of her before she could walk through them. In summer, the early light came in low and golden across the park and turned the wet grass into something that looked like it had been painted by someone who understood that beauty does not need to be complicated to be real. She was a school teacher. She taught mathematics to children between the ages of 11 and 16, and she was good at it in the way that people who do not believe they are good at anything are sometimes the best, thorough, patient, careful, never satisfied. Her classroom was neat, and her lessons were well prepared. And her students generally liked her, though she would not have believed you if you told her so. She kept a notebook in her desk drawer. Not a grade book, not a planner, but a small brown notebook with a soft cover. And in it she recorded, every evening after the last class, the things she had done wrong that day. Not mistakes in the usual sense. Not mathematical errors or scheduling conflicts. She recorded the moments when she felt she had failed at being the person she believed she should be, spoke too sharply to the boy in the third row, who would not stop tapping his pencil, did not notice that the quiet girl by the window had been crying until the class was nearly over, explained the equation too quickly, and saw the confusion on their faces, but kept going, because the lesson plan said to keep going. Ate lunch alone in the staff room, and did not join the conversation, because she felt she had nothing interesting to say. The notebook was almost full. 5 years of daily entries, 5 years of evidence, carefully collected, for a case she was building against herself. On one of her morning walks, in the middle of autumn, when the leaves on the willows had gone yellow and were falling into the canal in slow spirals, she met an old man sitting on the bench beside the footbridge. He was there most mornings. She had seen him before, but had never spoken to him, because speaking to strangers required a confidence she kept in a drawer she could not open. But this morning he spoke first. "You walk like someone who is being followed," he said. She stopped, startled. "I beg your pardon?" "Your shoulders," he said, gesturing with a hand that was thin and spotted with age. "They are up near your ears, and your eyes are on the ground. You walk as though something is right behind you, and you do not want to turn around and see what it is." She did not know what to say. The canal moved slowly beside them. A single leaf detached from the willow above and drifted down, landing on the water without a sound. "I am just walking," she said. "Yes," he said, "but there is walking, and there is fleeing on foot. They look the same from the outside." She almost walked on, but something in his voice, not pity, not judgment, just a kind of calm recognition, as though he were describing a weather pattern he had seen many times, made her stop. She sat down on the far end of the bench. "I am not fleeing," she said. "I am just reviewing." "Reviewing what?" "The day before, what I did wrong." He nodded slowly, as though this were the most natural thing in the world. "And do you also review what you did right?" She looked at him. The question landed somewhere she had not expected it to land. "No," she said after a moment. "That does not seem necessary." "Interesting," he said. "So you have appointed yourself both prosecutor and judge, but you have not hired a defense attorney." She laughed, a short, surprised sound that she immediately tried to pull back, as though laughing were something she needed permission for. "I used to do this too," the old man said. He looked out at the canal, where the reflections of the willow branches wavered and reformed with each small ripple. "Every night, I would lie in bed and go through the day like a detective, looking for evidence of my own failure. And I always found it. Because if you look for failure in any human day, you will find it. It is always there. The question is whether you also look for the rest. The rest, the kindness you showed without thinking about it. The moment you paused before speaking and chose the softer word. The fact that you showed up at all on a day when showing up was hard. Those things are in every day too. But they do not announce themselves. They do not tap you on the shoulder and say, "Look what you did right." They are quiet, and the failures are loud. And so the notebook fills with evidence for the prosecution, and the defense rests without ever being called. She sat with this for a while. The morning light was beginning to warm the stones of the footbridge. Somewhere across the park, a dog barked twice and then was quiet. The Buddha, the old man, said gently, taught that we should treat ourselves with the same compassion we would offer a dear friend. Not because we deserve special treatment, but because the voice in our own head is usually the cruelest voice we will ever hear, and we would never speak to a friend the way we speak to ourselves at 3 in the morning. She looked down at her hands in her lap. They were the hands of someone who had spent 5 years gripping a pen, writing evidence against herself, building a case that could never be won, because the judge and the accused were the same person. Tonight, if you recognize this woman, if you have ever lain in bed, reviewing the day, and finding it wanting, finding yourself wanting, then you already know that the trial never ends. There is always more evidence. There is always another entry for the notebook. The voice does not run out of material, but, perhaps, just for tonight, you can adjourn the court, not forever. Not even until morning, just until the next breath, just long enough to notice that the person lying here, tired, imperfect, still trying, is someone who showed up for another whole day. And showing up, on some days, is the bravest thing a person can do. There is an old parable about a traveler who arrived at a monastery carrying 2 heavy bags. One bag, he told the gatekeeper, contained all of his mistakes. The other contained all of the things other people had done to him. He asked the abbot where he should put them down. The abbot looked at the bags for a long time. Then she said, "The bag of what others have done to you. Set it by the door. You can pick it up on your way out if you still want it." "And the other one?" the traveler asked. "The one with my mistakes?" "Open it," the abbot said. The traveler opened the bag. Inside were stones, dozens of them, grey and smooth, each one with a word scratched into its surface. Impatient, careless, too late, not enough. He had been collecting them for years, picking up a new one after every stumble, every failure, every moment he believed he should have been better than he was. The abbot reached into the bag and took out a stone. She held it up to the light. "This is a nice stone," she said, "but it is just a stone. It is not you. You are the one who has been carrying it. And carrying is a choice, even when it does not feel like one." She set the stone on the ground beside the path. It sat there, small and grey and unremarkable, and the sunlight moved across it the same way it moved across everything else, without preference, without judgment, without memory. "You can leave them all here," the abbot said, "or you can carry them inside. But I will tell you this, the rooms here are small, and there is not much space for stones." There was a gardener who worked in a public park in a city where the buildings were tall and grey, and the sky between them was narrow. The park was not large. You could walk across it in 10 minutes, but it was old, and the trees had been growing there long enough that their roots had buckled the pathways, and their canopies met overhead in a green ceiling that filtered the sunlight into something softer, something kinder than the light on the streets outside. The gardener arrived at 6 every morning, before the joggers and the dog walkers and the mothers with strollers, and she would stand at the gate for a moment, breathing in the particular smell of the park at dawn. Wet bark, turned earth, the sweetness of whatever was blooming that week. And underneath all of it, the faint metallic tang of the city that never quite went away. Even here, she had not always been a gardener. In her 30s, she had been an architect, a successful one, with her name on buildings and her photograph in magazines. She had designed a library that won an award and a concert hall that people traveled from other cities to see. But somewhere inside that success, something had started to crack. Not the buildings. She cracked. The voice in her head, the one that had driven her through architecture school, through the competitions, through the late nights, bent over drawings that were never quite precise enough. That voice had grown louder with each achievement, not quieter. Every award was followed by the certainty that the next project would reveal her as a fraud. Every compliment was quietly rewritten in the margins of her mind as something people said to be polite. She began sleeping less. She began checking her drawings 8, 9, 10 times before submitting them. She began dreaming about buildings collapsing, slowly, gracefully, folding in on themselves like paper. And in the dream she was always standing inside them, watching the ceiling come down, knowing it was her fault. She left architecture at 42. Not dramatically. She simply stopped going to the office one Monday and did not go back. She spent a year doing very little, walking, reading, sitting in this same park on a bench near the pond, where the ducks gathered in the late afternoon. And one day she noticed that the flower bed near the east gate was overgrown and neglected, and she knelt down and began pulling weeds. No one asked her to. No one was watching. She just knelt in the dirt and pulled, and for the first time in years, the voice in her head was quiet. She asked the city for a job. They gave her the park. That was 8 years ago. She was not the same person she had been. Not because she had fixed the voice. It was still there, some mornings, waiting for her like an old dog that would not leave the porch. But she had learned something about it. She had learned that the voice was not her. It was a sound, like traffic, like the wind in the trees above her. It was a sound that had opinions, and those opinions were sometimes loud, but they were not facts. They were weather, and weather passes. A young man who worked in the office building across the street used to come to the park on his lunch break. He would sit on the same bench every day, hunched over his phone, scrolling with the particular intensity of someone who is not really looking at the screen, but using it as a shield against something else. One day the gardener was planting tulip bulbs near his bench, and he looked up and said, almost to himself, "I do not know how you do it." "Do what?" she asked, her hands deep in the soil. "Look so peaceful, like you are not worried about anything." She sat back on her heels and wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of dirt. "I worry constantly," she said. "I worry that I planted the bulbs too deep. I worry that the frost will come early. I worry that the roses near the fountain have a disease I cannot identify." She smiled. "But I have stopped worrying about whether the worrying makes me a bad gardener. That is the part I let go of. The judgment of the worry, not the worry itself." He looked at her as though she had said something in a language he almost understood, but not quite. "You cannot stop the rain," she said, "but you can stop blaming yourself for getting wet." Thich Nhat Hanh once said that to be beautiful means to be yourself, and that you do not need to be accepted by others. You need to accept yourself. He said it simply, the way he said most things, as though the truth were a pebble he had picked up from the ground and was holding out for you to see. There is a kind of moss that grows on the north side of stones in old forests. It does not grow quickly. It does not bloom. It does not produce fruit or flowers or anything that the world would call impressive. It simply covers the stone, slowly over years, in a layer of green so soft that if you press your thumb into it, it feels like velvet. The stone does not ask the moss to justify its presence. The moss does not apologize for being small. They simply exist together. The hard thing and the soft thing, and between them, they create something that neither could create alone. A place where water gathers, where insects shelter, where seeds land and take root. The moss does not know it is doing anything important. It is simply being what it is, in the only place it knows how to be. And that is enough. It has always been enough. Perhaps tonight you can be the moss, not the stone, not the architect, not the person who builds and judges and measures and finds the measurement lacking. Just the soft, quiet thing that grows where it is, without apology, without performance, without the need to be anything other than what it already is. And perhaps your body is already showing you how. Perhaps your breathing has slowed without you deciding to slow it. Perhaps the weight of the blanket feels less like something on top of you and more like something holding you. Gently, the way the earth holds the roots of a tree, not by gripping, but by being solid enough to lean against. Let us rest here for a moment. The night is deeper now. The stories are beginning to slow, the way a river slows when it nears the sea. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is one more teaching I would like to share tonight, before we begin our journey toward rest. It has to do with the quiet hunger for more time, more certainty, more proof that we are enough. It begins in a market square, on a morning when the fog was so thick you could not see the end of your own hand. There is a particular kind of hunger that has nothing to do with the body. The stomach is full, the house is warm, the bed is made, and still, somewhere beneath all of it, there is a reaching, a hand extended towards something just out of sight, something the mind insists is missing, even when it cannot say what it is. One more achievement, one more confirmation, one more purchase, one more compliment, one more year, one more proof that the life you are living is the right one. The hunger does not come from emptiness. It comes from the belief that fullness is somewhere else, somewhere you have not arrived yet, somewhere just past the next corner, the next raise, the next milestone. And the corner never stops moving. The Buddha had a name for this. He called it tanha, thirst. Not the thirst of a body that needs water, the thirst of a mind that believes it needs more of everything in order to be complete. He said it gently, the way you might tell someone who has been running for a very long time, you can stop now. There is no one chasing you. There is an old story about a merchant who traveled from town to town, selling silk. He was good at his trade, and his cart was always full. He had fine cloth in 12 colors, and thread so smooth it slipped through your fingers like water. But he was never satisfied with what he carried. In every town he visited, he would see another merchant with a different cloth, a heavier weave, a brighter dye, a pattern he had not thought of. And he would feel a tightening in his chest, a small sharp feeling like a fishhook pulling him forward. He would trade half his stock for the new cloth, then arrive in the next town and see something else, and trade again. By the end of each season, his cart was full of things he had not started with and could not sell, because he had been chasing variety instead of value. One evening, sitting beside his cart on a road between two towns, surrounded by cloth no one wanted, he said to the stars, "I have everything, and none of it is mine." A traveler passing by heard him and stopped. She was an old woman carrying nothing but a walking stick and a small cloth bag. "What do you have in your bag?" the merchant asked. "A bowl, a spoon, a blanket." "And that is enough," she smiled. "It is more than enough. It is exactly what I need. The bowl holds the soup. The spoon lifts it to my mouth. The blanket keeps me warm. Anything more than that would simply be something else to carry." The merchant looked at his overloaded cart, at the silks spilling over the sides, at the wheels sinking into the mud under the weight of abundance, and for the first time, He understood that the heaviness he had been feeling was not fatigue. It was the weight of reaching for things he did not need in order to fill a space that was not actually empty. That story is very old, but the hunger it describes has not changed. It is the same hunger that scrolls through a phone at midnight, looking for something it cannot name. The same hunger that opens the refrigerator door, stares inside, closes it, and opens it again. The same hunger that earns the promotion and feels the glow for a day, perhaps two, before the glow fades and the reaching begins again. In a market square, in a town where the river met the sea, there was a woman who sold candles. The square was paved with stones that had been worn into shallow bowls by centuries of rain. And on foggy mornings, and there were many, because the sea air pushed the mist inland almost every night, the stones would fill with thin pools of water that reflected the sky in small, trembling circles. The fog on those mornings was so thick you could not see the end of your own hand, and the market stalls emerged from the whiteness, one by one, as you walked, like islands appearing out of a calm sea. Her stall was small, a wooden table with a cloth over it, and on the cloth, candles arranged in rows. She made them herself from beeswax she bought from a farmer outside town, and they were simple. No dyes, no scent added, no carved designs, just clean, pale candles that burned with a steady golden flame and smelled, when lit, faintly of honey and summer grass. She had been selling candles in this square for 20 years, and in that time she had watched other stall-keepers come and go. The soap maker, who expanded into lotions and bath salts, and eventually rented a shop on the high street that he could not afford and closed within 2 years. The woman who sold jams, and then added chutneys, and then added sauces, and then added spice blends until her stall was so crowded with jars that customers could not find anything and stopped coming. The leather worker who took on so many commissions that he began delivering late, then later, then not at all, until the only thing his reputation held was the memory of promises unkept. The candle maker had watched all of this with the quiet attention of someone who has learned that the most dangerous word in business, and perhaps in life, is more. A young woman who had recently opened a bakery nearby came to the candle maker one afternoon when the fog was beginning to thin and the square was emptying out. She was anxious. Business was fine, she said, but she felt she should be doing more, adding a coffee counter, offering catering, expanding into the space next door, staying open later, opening earlier. She listed the possibilities the way someone lists symptoms, hoping the listener will identify the disease. The candle maker listened, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her unsold candles glowing faintly in the grey light. "How many kinds of candle do I sell?" she asked, when the young woman had finished. "One," the baker said, "plain beeswax." "And how long have I been here?" "Longer than anyone." "There is a reason for that," the candle maker said. "It is not because my candles are the best candles in the world. It is because I know what they are, and I know what they are not. They are not scented. They are not colored. They are not shaped like flowers or animals or anything clever. They are candles. They hold a flame. They light a room. And when someone buys one, they know exactly what they are getting." She paused. "The moment I start adding things, scent, color, shapes, variety, I am no longer selling a candle. I am selling the idea that what I already make is not enough. And if I believe that, my customers will believe it too." The young baker sat quietly for a moment. The last of the fog was lifting off the square, revealing the river beyond the rooftops, flat and silver in the late afternoon light. "So I should not expand." "I did not say that. I said you should know why you want to. If you want to expand because the work calls you there, then go. But if you want to expand because you are afraid that what you already have is not enough, then the expansion is not growth. It is running, and you will carry the not enough feeling with you into every new room you open. The young baker did not say anything for a while. She looked at the candles on the table, their pale, simple shapes, their quiet certainty of purpose. Then she stood up, thanked the candle maker, and walked back across the square toward her bakery. The fog had lifted entirely now, and the wet stones of the square shone in the last of the afternoon light, like something that had been polished by patient hands. The candle maker began packing up her unsold stock, wrapping each candle in brown paper with the same slow, careful motions she had used for 20 years. She did not seem troubled by the ones that had not sold. She simply wrapped them and placed them back in the wooden crate, knowing they would be there tomorrow, the same as they were today. And that sameness was not stagnation. It was steadiness, and steadiness, she had learned, was the rarest kind of wealth. An old Zen saying puts it this way: the person who knows they have enough is rich, not the person who has the most. The person who has stopped counting. There was a man who had spent most of his life collecting things. Not valuable things, necessarily. Not art or antiques, or anything that would impress a visitor. He collected the way some people breathe, constantly, automatically, without ever stopping to ask whether it was necessary. Books he would never read, stacked in towers against the walls of his apartment, until the hallways became narrow paths winding between paper cliffs. Kitchen gadgets, still in their original packaging, bought from late-night advertisements, because they promised to make something easier that was never difficult to begin with. Clothes he had worn once or never, hanging in closets, so tightly packed that the doors would not close, and the fabric smelled of dust, and the particular staleness of things that have been forgotten, while still technically being owned. Boxes of photographs he had not opened in decades. Warranties for products he no longer possessed. Receipts for meals he could not remember eating, folded into a shoebox that sat on top of a filing cabinet that was itself full of papers he could not bring himself to throw away. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that overlooked a small courtyard where an elderly woman grew tomatoes in clay pots. He could see her from his kitchen window. Or he could have, if the window were not entirely blocked by a stack of cookbooks and a bread machine he had used exactly once 4 years ago, on a rainy Sunday afternoon, when he had briefly believed that baking his own bread would transform him into a calmer, more grounded kind of person. The bread had been dense and slightly raw in the center, and he had thrown it away. But the machine remained on the counter, gathering dust, a monument to a version of himself that had lasted approximately 3 hours. He was not unhappy, exactly. He was full. Full in the way a room is full when you can no longer move through it without turning sideways and holding your breath. Full in the way a mind is full when every surface is covered and there is no clear open space left where a new thought might land. One spring, the building's old pipes burst during a heavy rain, and the apartment flooded. Not catastrophically, just 2 inches of brown water, spreading slowly across every floor, soaking the bottom layer of every stack, every box, every forgotten pile. The fire department came and helped him carry things out to the curb. It took 4 hours and 6 trips up and down the stairs. When it was finished, he stood on the sidewalk in the fading light, looking at the mountain of his possessions, warped books with their pages fanned open, like dead birds, soggy cardboard boxes collapsing under their own weight, ruined clothes in colors he did not remember choosing, broken gadgets leaking water from their seams. And he felt something he had not expected. He did not feel grief. He did not feel panic. He felt lighter, as though the water had not destroyed his things, but had quietly dissolved a wall he had been building around himself for 30 years, without knowing it was a wall at all. He did not replace what was lost. He cleaned the apartment. He painted the walls a simple white. He kept the bed, one table, 2 chairs, a small shelf of books he truly loved, and the kitchen things he actually used. 1 good knife, 1 heavy pot, 1 well-seasoned pan, a kettle that whistled when the water was ready. Everything else he gave away or set by the curb with a sign that said free. And when he was done, he stood in the middle of his apartment and looked around at the clean, sunlit space. And he could see the courtyard through the kitchen window for the first time in years. The old woman's tomatoes hanging green and heavy on the vine, and beyond them the terracotta rooftops, and beyond the rooftops the sky, wide and open and blue, and asking absolutely nothing of him. His neighbor from downstairs came up to check on him a few days later and stopped in the doorway, her eyes wide. "It looks so empty," she said. "It looks like enough," he said. Pema Chödrön once observed that we spend most of our lives trying to get comfortable, adding more layers, more insulation, more distance between ourselves and the rawness of simply being alive. But it is in the rawness, in those moments when the layers are stripped away and we are left standing with only what is essential, that we finally feel the solid ground beneath our feet. Tonight, as you lie here, you are already in the most stripped-down version of your day. The doing is done. The adding is over. There is nothing left to acquire, nothing left to achieve, nothing left to prove before the morning comes. There is only this, the dark room, the weight of the blanket pressing gently against your body, the sound of this voice, and the breath that moves through you without being asked and without needing your permission to continue. You have enough. You are enough. Not because you earned it today, but because enough was never something that needed to be earned. It was always already here, underneath the pile, the way the floor of that apartment was always there, beneath the boxes. Solid, patient, waiting to be seen. Perhaps you can feel it now. The ground beneath all the reaching, the stillness beneath all the wanting. It does not ask anything of you. It simply holds you, the way the earth holds a river, not by gripping, but by offering a place to flow. Let us rest here. Let the breath come slowly. Let the body sink deeper into whatever is holding it. There is nowhere left to go tonight, and nothing left to gather. Everything you need for this moment is already in the room. When you are ready, we will begin our final journey together. Not toward anything new, but back, gently, slowly, through the places we have visited tonight, through the stories and the faces and the quiet truths that have been offered to us here in the dark. It begins, as all endings do, with a long, slow breath. We have come to the end of our journey tonight, and what a journey it has been. Through gardens on cliffs and workshops that smelled of clay, across old stone bridges, and along canals where the willows touched the water, into tea shops and bakeries, and concert halls where someone played a nocturne with an imperfect hand and found it was enough. We have met a woman who rebuilt her garden wall every spring, and a man who held a stopped watch in a velvet pouch, and a teacher who kept a notebook full of her own failures. We have walked with a fisherman who could not stop living in tomorrow, and 2 brothers who almost lost each other to the weight of being right. We have watched a candle maker wrap her simple wares in brown paper, and a collector stand in a clean, empty apartment and see the sky for the first time in years. Each of them, in their own way, was learning the same thing, not a complicated thing, not something that requires years of study or special training, or a particular kind of mind. Just this, that the heaviness we carry is not usually the thing itself, not the broken wall, not the stopped watch, not the imperfect bowl. The heaviness is the grip, the holding on, the refusal to let what is passing pass through us without trying to catch it and keep it and make it stay. And yet, knowing this does not make it easy. The Buddha knew that. He did not teach letting go because it was simple. He taught it because it was necessary, and because the alternative, the clenched fist, the tight jaw, the mind running its loops at 3 in the morning, is a kind of suffering so familiar that most of us have forgotten it is suffering at all. We think it is just the way life feels. We think the weight is part of the furniture, but it is not. It is something we picked up, and anything we picked up, we can, when we are ready, set down. There is a second thread that has been running through tonight's stories, quieter than the first, but no less important. It is the thread of self-kindness, the school teacher with her notebook, the architect who became a gardener, the potter who could not stop correcting his bowls. Each of them had turned inward with a sharpness they would never have aimed at another person. Each of them had become their own harshest critic, their own most relentless judge, building cases against themselves, with evidence gathered from ordinary days that were, by any reasonable measure, good enough. Perhaps the deepest letting go is not the letting go of things, or people, or the past, or the future. Perhaps it is the letting go of the idea that you should be someone other than who you are right now. Not the better version, not the fixed version, not the version that finally gets it right. Just this version, the one lying here in the dark, tired and imperfect and still breathing. The Buddha once said that you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. He did not say you deserve it when you have earned it. He did not say you deserve it after you have improved. He said, you deserve it now as you are, without condition. I would like to tell you one more story before we rest. It is a longer story than the others, and a slower one, and it does not take place in a monastery or beside a river or in any place that might seem particularly wise. It takes place in a very ordinary house, on a very ordinary street, in a life that looked, from the outside, like nothing remarkable at all. There was a woman who lived alone in a house, at the end of a street, where the pavement gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to a field of tall grass that moved in the wind like something breathing. The house was small and old, and painted a shade of blue that had faded over the years into something closer to the color of a winter sky just before snow. The porch sagged slightly on the left side, and the boards creaked when you stepped on them in a pattern she knew so well she could walk across it in the dark without thinking. The screen door did not close all the way. It hung open about an inch, just enough for the evening air to slip through. And in summer the smell of honeysuckle came through that gap so thickly you could almost taste it on your tongue, sweet and green and wild. The inside of the house was simple. A kitchen with a window above the sink, where she could see the field while she washed the dishes. A living room with 2 chairs angled toward each other beside a window. One of them still held the faint impression of someone's weight, a shallow dip in the cushion that she had never tried to smooth out. A hallway with framed photographs that she dusted every Sunday, not out of obligation, but out of something closer to tenderness, the way you might brush the hair from a sleeping child's face. The bedroom was at the back of the house, and in the early morning, before the sun cleared the tree line, the room was filled with a blue-gray light that made everything look as though it existed slightly outside of time. She had lived in this house for 40 years. She had raised 2 children here, in rooms that still held the faint outlines of where their posters had been taped to the walls. Rectangles of slightly brighter paint where the sun had not reached. Her son lived 3 hours away now and called every Sunday evening. Her daughter lived farther and called less often, not out of carelessness, but out of the particular busyness that comes with young children and a job that never quite lets you go. The woman understood this. She did not keep score. Her husband had died 11 years ago, on a Tuesday morning in October, while she was hanging laundry in the backyard. It had been one of those October days when the air is sharp and clear, and the light has a quality that makes everything look more real than usual, as though someone had adjusted the focus on the world. She had come inside with the smell of clean sheets still on her hands, and found him sitting in his chair by the window, with his reading glasses still on his face, and a book open in his lap, to a page he would never finish. She had stood there for a long time, looking at him, and what she remembered most about that moment was not the grief that came later, and it came in waves that lasted not weeks or months but years, but the stillness. How impossibly still the room was, how still he was, how the dust motes hung in the light from the window like tiny suspended worlds, as though time itself had paused to let her understand what had happened before it moved forward again. She did not leave the house after he died, though her children asked her to, gently at first, and then with increasing urgency, with brochures for apartments in their cities, and arguments about safety and loneliness and stairs. She did not want to leave, not because she was clinging to him. She had let him go, in her way, slowly, over months and years, the way you let go of a hand you have been holding for a very long time, finger by finger, until you realize that the warmth you feel is not his hand anymore, but the memory of it. And the memory is not a trap but a companion, and the companion is enough. She stayed because the house was where her life had happened, and she wanted to be near it, not inside it, just near it. The way you might sit beside a river you once swam in, not to swim again, but just to hear the water and to know that it is still there, still moving, still carrying something downstream. Her days were simple. She woke early, before the light, and lay in bed listening to the birds begin their first tentative calls, testing the air the way singers test a microphone. One note, then silence, then another, then a flood. She made coffee in a pot that was older than both her children, a percolator with a dented lid that made a sound like quiet conversation when it brewed. She poured the coffee into a cup that had a chip on the rim that she had never repaired, because the chip was exactly where her thumb fit, and the fit was so perfect that repairing it would have felt like losing something. She carried the cup to the porch and sat in the chair on the right side. His chair was the one on the left, and she did not sit in it, but she did not avoid looking at it either. It was just there, part of the porch, part of the morning. She tended a garden that was not large: tomatoes, green beans, basil, thyme, a few pepper plants that never produced much, but that she kept anyway because they tried so hard. Along the fence, she grew a row of sunflowers that rose taller than she was every July, their broad faces tracking the sun across the sky with a kind of patient devotion, and then bowing their heavy heads as August turned to September, dropping seeds onto the soil beneath them, as though they were showing her what it looked like to carry something beautiful for as long as you could, and then, when the time came, to let it fall. She did not call what she did a practice. She did not sit in meditation, or read scriptures, or follow any tradition that had a name she knew. But if you watched her closely, if you sat on the porch with her for an hour and paid attention to the way she moved through the morning, you would see something that looked very much like what the Buddha described When he spoke of the middle way, she did not chase happiness. She did not run from sorrow. She let both arrive. She let both pass through. She drank her coffee. She watched the field. She noticed the light changing across the grass and did not try to hold it in one place. Her neighbor, a younger woman who worked long hours at a job she did not love and came home most evenings, looking as though she had been carrying something heavy up, a flight of stairs that never ended, sometimes stopped by on Saturday mornings. She would sit on the porch step with her knees drawn up and drink the coffee that was always offered and never declined. And she would ask questions the way people ask quick questions when they suspect the person across from them knows something important that they have not yet been able to name. "How do you do it?" the neighbor asked one evening. When the sky was turning the color of ripe peaches and the first fireflies were beginning to appear at the edge of the field, blinking their small green lights like signals from a world that runs on a different clock. "Do what?" "This. Sit here. Be okay after everything." The old woman was quiet for a while. A firefly drifted close to the honeysuckle and blinked twice, then floated away. The screen door shifted in the breeze with a sound like a slow exhale. "I am not always okay," she said. "Some mornings I wake up and the missing is so heavy I cannot get out of bed for an hour. I just lie there, feeling it, the way you feel a stone in your shoe. Some evenings I set 2 places at the table before I remember." She paused. Her hands were wrapped around the cup, the chipped rim resting against her thumb. "But I have learned something. Over these years, I have learned that the missing does not need to be fixed. It does not need to go away for me to have a good day. It just needs room, and I give it room. I let it sit in the chair by the window. I let it have its coffee, and then, when it is ready, it gets up and wanders off for a while. And I go on with my day. It always comes back, but so do I." "That sounds sad," the neighbor said softly. "It sounds like it should be, does it not? But it is not sad. Not anymore. It is just life. Life with space in it. Life with room for the heavy thing and the light thing to exist in the same room, at the same time, without one canceling the other out. The sunflowers and the falling petals, the full cup and the empty chair, the morning bird song and the silence that comes after." She looked out at the field where the fireflies were now scattered across the grass like fallen stars that had decided to keep shining. "I think the mistake I used to make, the mistake most of us make, is believing that we have to choose, that we have to be either happy or sad, either holding on or letting go, either healed or broken. But it was never a choice, it was always a rhythm, like breathing. You breathe in and you breathe out, you hold and you release, and neither one is wrong, neither one is failure. The breathing is the whole thing, the rhythm is the whole thing." The neighbor finished her coffee and stood up slowly. "Thank you," she said, though she could not have said exactly what she was thanking the old woman for. Perhaps it was for the coffee. Perhaps it was for the permission to stop choosing. "Come back anytime," the old woman said. "The coffee is always on. The porch is always here. And so am I, for now, which is the only time any of us are anywhere." After the neighbor left, the old woman sat alone in the deepening dark. The field rustled with the sound of grass blades, bending and releasing in a breeze so light it barely moved the air. The screen door creaked its slow creak. Somewhere far across the field, a dog barked once, a single, clear note that hung in the evening for a moment, and then dissolved, the way all sounds dissolve, the way all things dissolve, leaving only the quiet that was there before them and will be there after. The fireflies went on with their silent work, appearing and disappearing, as though they were practicing the only lesson the night had left to teach. That light does not need to be permanent to be beautiful. and that the dark is not the absence of light, but simply the space where light rests between one shining and the next. She closed her eyes. She did not think about the past. She did not plan the morning. She simply sat, breathing, feeling the cool air on her face, and the solid wood of the chair beneath her, and the vast, patient stillness of the world settling in around her the way water settles in a bowl, slowly, without effort, finding its own level, filling every space it is given, without asking for more. If this brought you some peace tonight, you are welcome to subscribe for more long-form audio like this, and share it with anyone who could use a slower, quieter night. Original commentary, stories and script, written and produced by Moonlit Dharma. Thank you for being here with us tonight. And now, let us begin the gentlest part of our journey, the part that belongs not to the mind, but to the body. Perhaps you have noticed over these hours that something has shifted, not dramatically, not in a way you could point to and name, but somewhere in the listening, somewhere between the first story and this moment, the body began its own quiet work. It did not wait for permission. It did not need to be told. It simply began to let go, the way it does every night when the conditions are right, when the room is dark, when the voice is steady, when there is nothing left to solve. Perhaps your shoulders have dropped, not because you decided to drop them, but because they have been listening too, and they heard something in tonight's stories that gave them permission to release the day. They may have been holding it since morning. The tension of sitting, of driving, of carrying bags or children, or the invisible weight of responsibilities that no one sees but you. They are tired, and they are ready, and they are already lower than they were when we began. Perhaps your jaw has softened. The jaw holds more than we know. It holds the words we did not say, the frustrations we swallowed, the arguments we clenched between our teeth and carried through the afternoon like a stone we could not spit out and could not swallow. But now, in the dark, there is no one to argue with. There are no words that need to be held back. The jaw can rest. The teeth can part, just slightly, just enough for the breath to pass through without effort. Perhaps your hands have opened. They may still be resting on the blanket or tucked beside the pillow or folded across your chest. But somewhere inside them, the gripping has stopped. The fingers are heavier than they were. The palms are softer. They are not reaching for anything. They are not holding anything. They are simply hands. Warm, quiet, done with their work for today. Perhaps your breathing has changed, without you choosing to change it. It may be slower now, deeper. The kind of breathing that happens when the body trusts the room it is in. Each inhale comes a little easier than the last. Each exhale carries something out with it. Not anything you could name, just a faint heaviness, a residue of the day, dissolving into the dark the way mist dissolves when the morning warms. Perhaps your eyes, behind their closed lids, have stopped searching. They searched all day, for screens, for faces, for information, for the right thing to say, for the exit sign, for the clock. But now there is nothing to look for. The dark is enough. The stillness is enough. The eyes can rest in the soft blackness, the way a bird rests on a still pond, floating without effort, carried by something that does not need to be understood to be trusted. And perhaps your whole body, the full weight of it, every bone and muscle, every joint and tendon, has begun to feel heavier. Not the heaviness of burden, the heaviness of surrender, the heaviness that comes when you stop holding yourself up and finally, let the bed do what it has been waiting all day to do. Hold you completely, without condition, without judgment, without asking anything in return. You are held right now. You may not feel it as a thought, but your body knows it. The mattress beneath you is solid. The pillow is cradling the weight of your head, a weight you carried upright through every hour of the day. And now it is resting, fully resting. For the first time since morning, the blanket is not just covering you. It is pressing gently against you, the way a hand might rest on the back of someone who is crying, not to fix anything, just to say, I am here. I know. You can stop now. Tonight we walk through 7 rooms of letting go. Letting go of control. Letting go of the past. Letting go of perfection. Letting go of the future. Letting go of being right. Letting go of the voice that judges. Letting go of the hunger for more. 7 rooms. 7 doors that opened when we stopped pushing and simply stood still. But perhaps the truest letting go is the one that is happening right now, in this breath, in this body, in this room. It is not a decision. It is not something you do. It is something that happens to you when you stop doing everything else. The way sleep comes, not when you chase it, not when you demand it, but when you finally stop trying to make it arrive. When you lie still and let the night be the night, and let the body be the body, and let the breath be the breath. And it comes to you the way rain comes to a field, not because the field asked for it, but because that is what rain does. It falls. It finds the low places. It gathers where it is needed. Dogen once wrote that enlightenment is like the moon reflected in water. The moon does not get wet. The water is not broken. The whole sky and the whole moon and the whole body of water are contained in a single dewdrop on a blade of grass. Perhaps tonight is your dewdrop, one small, still moment that holds everything, every story, every teaching, every breath, without needing to be anything more than what it is. The night is deep now. The stories have come to their end. The voices of all the people we met tonight, the gardener on the cliff, the watchmaker at his table, the monk on the bridge, the potter and the weaver, and the fisherman, and the brothers in the tea shop, and the teacher with her notebook, and the woman on her porch. All of their voices have grown quiet now, the way voices do when the hour is late, and the candle is low, and there is nothing left to say that the silence does not already know. You do not need to carry any of their stories with you into sleep. You do not need to remember a single word. If something landed tonight, if one image, one phrase, one quiet truth found its way to a place inside you that was waiting for it, it will still be there in the morning. Not because you held on to it, but because it held on to you. The field outside the old woman's house is still there. The fireflies are still blinking. The grass is still moving in the breeze. The porch is still standing, and the chair is still warm, and the coffee cup with the chipped rim is still sitting on the railing where she left it. Nothing has ended. The stories are simply resting now. The way you are resting, the way the whole world rests when the lights go down and the talking stops, and the only sound left is the sound of breathing. Yours and the night's, rising and falling together, steady and slow, like 2 old friends who have run out of words and are content, at last, to simply sit in the quiet and let the darkness hold whatever it will hold. For as long as the darkness lasts, which is never quite as long as we fear, and never quite as short as we wish, but always exactly long enough,